Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the Grawemeyer Award for ideas to improve the world order? How can many of these ideas be used to pursue peace in very volatile areas of the world, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Syria, or perhaps Ukraine? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at a very unique program that's operated by the University of Louisville. It's the Grawemeyer Awards, and my guest today is an expert on this program. My guest today is Dr. Charles Ziegler. Dr. Charles Ziegler is a professor and distinguished university scholar at the University of Louisville. Dr. Ziegler is the director of the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. He is also the executive director of the Louisville Committee on Foreign Relations. Dr. Chuck Ziegler, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thanks, Bill. Great to be with you.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's just jump right into it. What is the Grawemeyer Award? When was it started? Why was it started? What does it do?
Well, the Grawemeyer Awards were set up by Charles Grawemeyer, who's a Louisville philanthropist. The first one was a music award established in 1985, and then the World Order Award was first given in 1988. The World Order Award, which I direct, is an award for ideas that will in some way improve world order. They need to be feasible, they need to be workable, and they also need to be in written form published within the past 5 years. So I've been directing the award for the past 3 years, but I was in on its founding years ago when Charles Grawemeyer came to us.
Mm-hmm. And you would invite the public to nominate people who are experts in certain areas, and they can do that by going to your website?
Yes, we don't allow self-nomination, but usually what these are will be either scholars or statespersons who are nominated by other professionals. Oftentimes we do have publishers nominate. And we end up with anywhere between 35 and 60 works per year submitted, and they go through a lengthy review process that takes nearly 10 months before we finally end up with a winner. So it's a very selective, very demanding process.
Mm-hmm. And what is the reward or award? What do you get?
At present, the award is $100,000. But that varies. It's based on an endowment, and it varies depending on the return, generally between $100,000 and $200,000.
Mm-hmm. That's very substantial. That's
it
very
is.
good.
As far as we know, in political science, it is the largest award out there.
It certainly sounds like it, yes. Well, we're going to try something very risky, and I'm going to try to reach over and get these 4 books. You brought some samples of various recipients, really,
right.
Awards, and I'm going to try to hold these up, and you can tell me. I'm going to make sure I get it right. Jacques Heyman's Achieving Nuclear Ambitions, Scientists, Politicians, and Proliferation.
Yes.
What exactly is this one?
Jacques Heyman's, who's a political scientist at the University of Southern California. This book is challenging in that he argues that authoritarian states really are not quite the nuclear proliferators that we would think, because they tend to interfere politically in the work of the scientists whom they task with developing nuclear weapons. So it's a cautionary argument that for a North Korea or an Iraq or an Iran, really the chances of successfully building a nuclear bomb are not as great as we might think.
Now that whole argument seems like it would tie right into what's going on with what's happening
Iran,
in North Korea and Iran in particular.
In particular,
and
yes.
with the United Nations International Atomic Energy Agency monitoring and working in this area. And of course, the negotiations are underway. Would this not be helpful?
I think it's very helpful because it says, with regard to Iran, for example, some people have talked about a strike to take out any nuclear potential as they're trying to develop nuclear weapons. But Dr. Heyman's work suggests that they have real difficulties in bringing this project to fruition. And that's what we've seen. It's taken a long time. We've been predicting an Iranian bomb for years, and it still hasn't happened.
Exactly. And a lot of the experts argued that really a strike is not feasible. It would promote more instability in the Middle East. Plus, you're not guaranteed of actually finding the nuclear weapon sites, or the nuclear sites, I should say, not weapon sites.
That's true. And he also points out that if you do that, what that really does is a strike would generate a nationalist backlash, and scientists who've been put upon by their authoritarian rulers and who perhaps didn't work very hard before, all of a sudden they're motivated to really go ahead and develop the weapon. So it can be counterproductive.
Exactly. So the military option should be off the table and negotiations should continue.
Maybe it shouldn't be off the table, but we should think carefully, very carefully before using it.
Okay. Now the second one you have here is Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, by Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Stephan.
Yes. Erica Chenoweth is with the University of Denver. Maria Stephan is with the U.S. State Department. And this is a great book. They developed a database of violent and nonviolent conflicts over the past more than 100 years to try to assess which worked better. And Erica Chenoweth had said she thought that violent resistance would be better at, say, overthrowing a dictatorial regime or achieving goals. But they found that nonviolent resistance, first, it works twice as well as violent resistance. And secondly, in the aftermath, there's a much better chance of building a stable democratic system if nonviolent methods were used than violent methods. And it's a remarkable book. It got a lot of attention.
Now, do you have to have certain types of government or certain mentalities, I should say? For example, we think of India with Mahatma Gandhi and the nonviolent movement against the British, the United Kingdom years ago, back in the 40s. But how would that work today? Would it have worked with Saddam Hussein in Iraq? Or would it work with al-Assad in Syria? Are we talking about two different types of governments, or would they actually let that take place?
Well, as they say, nonviolent resistance does not always work. And of course, there's a question, would it work against Saddam Hussein, against a Hitler? And I think Syria is one example where it didn't work, where it began as nonviolent, and then the government responded with violence. But again, they are looking at, I think, 600 different cases. And statistically, when you look at that many cases, they find that regardless of the type of political system, it does work better.
Exactly. There are always exceptions to the rule.
Of course.
Without a doubt.
But
yes.
this is a generalization, and they find this pattern.
Now, we've talked about some hot spots, and here's really one, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and this is the trouble with the Congo, local violence and the failure of international peacekeeping, Séverine Autesserre.
Yes.
Right. What exactly is this book?
Well, Dr. Autesserre is a scholar at Barnard College in New York, and she's done a great deal of field work. She's worked with Médecins Sans Frontières and others, and she is often on the ground in different trouble spots. And her argument is that many of the well-meaning programs to try to build peace didn't really take into account the local sources of conflict. Conflicts over water resources, which are critical in poor areas, conflict over land, conflict over political power. And so her argument is that you really need to take into account not what's happening in the capital of a trouble spot like Congo or Libya or someplace like that, but get to know what's happening in the local areas and what are the sources of conflict there.
Exactly. You have to treat the entire problem. You just can't isolate and say, well, we have two groups fighting each other and we'll deal with those two groups, or you have a rebel group or whatever the case might be, but you have to look at the whole, take a macro approach.
Well, yes, but more accurately, the centralization of this sort of peace building doesn't work as well as, again, central control linked into, again, local operations.
Well, it's certainly been a challenge for the United Nations in that area. The UN's largest peacekeeping operation is in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and they do have many challenges. One day it's up, one day it's down. It seems like there are problems, but it's still, excuse me, it's essential to have this type of peacekeeping operation to help the people to get their lives back on track and to move forward. Now, the last one is The Power of Ideas. What exactly is this book?
That is the second in a series of books on the Grawemeyer Awards, on all 5 of them. And I brought that because we're in the process now of doing the 3rd book in the series. And the previous 2 were more descriptions of the awards by people who are involved, former directors. The 3rd book is going to have selections from some of the prominent winners in recent years. And so they have essays that will reflect on what it meant to them to win the award in terms of intellectual development of their ideas for improving world order. And so we'll understand more how Michael Johnston's book on corruption in various contexts and how that's helped develop his thinking by winning the Grawemeyer Award, for example.
Exactly. And with full disclosure, I have a vested interest in that I nominated somebody back in 1991, former Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, and she was the recipient, but it was really the Brundtland Commission report and Our Common Future book that was actually the winner of that particular year. But still, she was one who chaired it. And of course, out of that, Our Common Future, came this whole concept of sustainable development, and that was one of the underpinning really concepts in the 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development, the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, and it's in the vocabulary today. And now we hear sustainable development constantly. It's in the vernacular, and people are moving in that direction to focus on it. But I don't know, many other people may have nominated her too, but I do know I sent a letter recommending her in 1991. But it's a remarkable program, and would encourage our viewers to go to www.grawemeyer.org and tap into it and take a look at the criteria and see if there's someone, a scholar, that you would like to nominate and to be involved in the process.
Please, I'd encourage people to do that. We're looking for anyone who has a good idea which has been published in the past 5 years. But again, they can go to the website and get the details.
Exactly. Well, Chuck, you're involved in a lot of different areas of academic focal points, if you will. And one is in the politics of oil, the energy area. And of course, we look at that today, oil, or really energy, the whole concept of energy. We see nations vying to gain control of oil fields. We see countries buying up areas of the world. We see their conflicts over especially oil and that type of thing. What is the thrust of your course? We could spend the rest of the morning on this, but what is the basic thrust of that course?
Well, I do spend an entire semester on it.
Exactly, and we'll do it in 3 minutes.
We'll try to do it in 3 minutes. Basically, there are 2 foci in the course. One is on some of the things that you mentioned about the international dimension of it. There's a good deal of economics involved, oil markets, oil and national security interests of different countries. And then the second part of it is the impact of oil as a resource that produces what economists call rents, large amounts of profits rolling in, and how that impacts the political structure. And as one political scientist has argued, oil hinders democracy, that many of the oil-producing countries, not all, but many, are authoritarian. And there seems to be some link between that authoritarian structure and the production and foreign sale of oil.
Some foreign policy observers have really commented in the past that oil, it can be more of a bane than a blessing. That when you have this, you look at some of the countries and how they're oil rich, but they're people poor. And that so much of the revenue is not getting down to the people. And one wonders what's happening to the billions and tens of billions of dollars that's being produced through the oil fields. Are they going into Swiss bank accounts, or what is the situation? Do you encounter that?
We do. We deal with that in the course. A good example is Nigeria. I think Venezuela would be another. In Nigeria's case, in per capita terms, their GDP was higher in the early 1960s, right after independence, than it was after they ramped up oil production. And it's a good example of a country now where there is tremendous graft and corruption, where a few people get very rich, many people are poor. It's generated an ethnic conflict over these resources in the Niger Delta. So that's a good example of how it can be a bane, the oil curse, or the resource curse, as it's sometimes called.
Exactly. Resource curse covers more than just oil.
Right.
Exactly. Well, let's shift gears, but we're not really leaving the topic of this, really the horrific challenges, but let's think back to World War II. We think of the devastation of World War II. Over 60 million people died. You had the Holocaust that took place at that time. Europe lay in ruins. Parts of Asia had been destroyed. It was really a disastrous time for a large number of the people in the world. But we bring that forward today, and we look at what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or we look at what happened with the Hutus and the Tutsis with the genocide in 1994, I believe it was. Mm-hmm. We look at these conflicts, and there was a concept that came out of a 2005 conference at the United Nations called the Responsibility to Protect. They call it R2P. Just generally, what is R2P? And how does that responsibility apply to what's going on today, even though we could think about how, if it had been in existence maybe in World War II, some things may have been different, but how does that apply today to some of the horrific conditions that we see in certain areas of the world?
Well, actually, the concept really came out of a report that was funded by the Canadian government and International Commission in 2001. That developed this concept, and it was supposed to be a modification of the idea of humanitarian intervention, given what had happened in the 1990s in particular, in the Balkans, in Rwanda, and some other places, Somalia and so forth. The UN then picked up on it at its World Summit in 2005, and there are three basic ideas to this concept of R2P, or the responsibility to protect. First, it is that states have sovereign rights, but part of that sovereignty is they must also be responsible for their populations and take care of them. Mm-hmm. A second component is that if states don't exercise this responsibility, the international, or if they can't, the international community should be willing to step in and help them. The third and most controversial aspect is if they won't, or if the states are actually committing genocide. There are actually four conditions: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. If the state engages in that, then if the Security Council agrees, the international community may intervene to protect the populations. So, and interestingly, that concept of sovereignty as responsibility originated with two of our Grawemeyer winners, Francis Dung and Roberta Cohen, who developed this notion of sovereignty as responsibility in their work and won the 2005 award for it.
Mm-hmm. There's another direct link between your program and try to resolve some of these international problems. Well, as we look at, if we could just pull up an example, I'll just pull up Libya, for example. Mm-hmm. We saw when Muammar Gaddafi was involved in somewhat of a civil war with these people and was strafing them and that type of thing. The UN Security Council passed a resolution declaring a no-fly zone, which gave NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, cover to come in to block that area so that Gaddafi's planes could not strafe civilians. And that unfolded, of course, that mandate, there was mission creep that apparently took place, and ultimately Gaddafi was overthrown. But as we look at that today, are there other areas where that would apply if you could get the UN Security Council? Now, Syria, obviously, they're not going to get the Security Council to vote on this because Russia and possibly China would veto it. But are there areas where they might be able to bring this responsibility to protect, to help populations that are under siege? Would it work in some other area, perhaps?
Well, I think probably the best possibility would be if you have natural disasters such as a typhoon or an earthquake. And I think you have a much better chance if the government in question is willing to allow humanitarian aid to come in. The sort of forcible intervention, like you mentioned with Syria, I think is pretty much off the table for now because of Libya in large part. And as you said, many states, Russia and China in particular, although they abstained on that UN Security Council decision, they saw the whole regime change effort as going far beyond what they had envisioned. Even democratic countries like India and Brazil were unhappy with the outcome of that. And that seems to have really, I think, caused a problem for this concept of R2P. The big problem with it is, who is going to decide when and where you should intervene, particularly if a state does not want it. And you've got the state of relations we have with Russia now, and Russia will almost reflexively veto any violations of state sovereignty, I think simply to be a spoiler. China has legitimate concerns about that too, given its issues with its peripheral regions, with Xinjiang, with Taiwan, Tibet, and so forth.
Exactly. And of course, with the United Nations Security Council, the Security Council, if it passes a resolution, it's binding on the parties, but still by the same token, if there's to be some type of financing, funding, whatever, providing of equipment, military personnel, they have to come up with that. And so often it's not as easy to do. And we look at UN peacekeeping today, you have about 115,000 peacekeepers in 16 different missions around the world, and they're overstretched right now. You don't have enough peacekeepers, but if the countries do not step forward and put up the financial resources or the military resources, it's almost impossible to carry out these missions.
Right, and you're really not talking about peacekeeping with R2P either. And the scenario is, let's go back to Rwanda. I mean, there was a genocide basically that occurred very quickly within the space of a few weeks. And so you have to move very quickly. You have to get forces on the ground who will then stop the ethnic cleansing or the genocide or whatever is going on. And just the difficulty of moving quickly, of also sorting out what's going on, because many times these issues they're complex. There may be ethnic cleansing going on both sides. The Balkans, I think, were probably more complex than what's generally portrayed. And so that means that you almost inevitably end up taking sides, and you don't want to send an international force in to take sides in an internal conflict.
Exactly. One of the three criteria for UN peacekeeping is you have to be impartial. If you go in and you start fighting one side or the other, you're part of the problem, not part of the solution.
Right.
Well, we got so many other topics, but we're down to about our last 2 minutes. Chuck, let me ask you very briefly, what do you perceive as one or two of the major issues, problems confronting the United States, NATO, the United Nations as we move into the 21st century?
Well, I would say one issue is going to be Islamic radicalism, not necessarily terrorism, because that's containable. But we're seeing throughout much of the Middle East, Central Asia, parts of Southeast Asia, the spread of Islamic radicalism. We're seeing it in Iraq now, and North Africa. And this is going to be a continuing problem, I think, for quite a long time. There are many other issues out there, sadly. There's still a lot to be done to build world order. My personal view is that climate change is a major issue, and it's one where I wish the United States would take more of a lead. You had asked about the oil and politics issue earlier. If you look at what's happening with energy consumption, it's all in East Asia. Europe is not growing in its consumption. We're not. We're sort of peaked. But India, China, other parts of Asia, with the exception of Japan, we see rapidly growing consumption. And this is going to mean more carbon dioxide in the air, more global warming. But their position is, you've already developed your country. You've become affluent. Why shouldn't we have that same opportunity? And it's very hard to come up with an answer to that.
Exactly. Well, Dr. Chuck Ziegler, Director of the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order, you summarized it very nicely. And I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on Global Connections Television.